So maybe I'll start with a little bit of background of the work I've done until now. So a couple of years ago, I thought I wanted to do a project that is relatively easy but might have a big impact. And I thought, emotional modeling seems easy enough. So I started with this initial model, spent a huge amount of time thinking, introspecting, observing myself, observing other people, and trying to model this. And so I wrote my first model, and I did demos with it, and it seemed to be working quite fine. And I remember Dave was asking earlier, how do I feel about simultaneous emotions? And that was actually one of the problems that I ran into. I was modeling it the same way, saying we have all of these simultaneous emotions, but I wasn't sure exactly how they should interact and how they should be expressed. And that's when I decided I'm going to scrap my entire model and redesign the whole thing from scratch. So let's see. So the first question was, well, I'm going to try and not repeat too much of what Dave said because I agree with most of the things he said. The question is, why do we want emotional robots? The answer is simply that's what people want. It gives them warm, fuzzy feelings. They want their robots to be emotional. The question is why? And my answer is because humans communicate through emotion. And when we see something that looks humanoid, we want to communicate with it in the same way. The other reason is that when something has empathy for us, we tend to trust it. And I think that is something really important with robots. We need to build a trust relationship with them. We trust people who have empathy. We don't trust psychopaths. Where are we now? There's actually people usually, when they talk about emotional robotics, they tend to throw a whole bunch of things together. The first thing is there's the expression part, which is already kind of done. If you write a little game and now wins, you might have some sort of happy expression, but that's just a programmed expression. He doesn't understand the context or anything of that sort. Then there is recognition of emotions. So when you look at a human and his face expression, you need to be able to tell, is he happy, is he sad, how should you empathize with him? Then there is the actual experience. When the robot has an emotional experience, it affects what he wants to do. And that is more where I'm trying to focus at the moment. And then also a lot of people have done work on infant models. They say, well, we're going to look at the simplest possible model. We're going to see if we take a robot and make it respond like an infant, treat it like an infant, and can we make it emotional at that level? I know of at least 5 projects that have tried to do this. So I came up with a new paradigm where before that, I was thinking that we tend to think humans are emotional and we are way more complex than any other life forms. But my new paradigm is that all living beings are essentially the same. We all live with this emotional model, if you will. Whether you're a fly or an adult or an infant, at the core we all function in the same way. It's just the way that we process information is a lot more complex. So emotion is essentially a very primitive decision-making process. It's something that we've evolved over thousands of years, which means it's not something you could teach a robot in his lifetime, because the way we evolve is through death, sadly. The other thing with emotion is that, especially for animals, there's no thinking required. If you put your hand on a hot stove, you will feel pain and it will be negative emotion. You don't need to think about it. So emotions tells us things without explaining to us why. It just gives you a craving, like you're hungry, you need to eat. It doesn't explain to you that you need to eat it for nutritional purposes, otherwise you will die. You just have this craving to eat. And that is a very important point. Each emotion has a particular purpose in survival. For instance, if you're experiencing fear, it means that there's some sort of risk to you, and you see this as a negative experience that you're going to try and avoid. And I think there's also a very limited number of these emotional. I mean, you get different variants of the same emotion, but I think at a core, there's only so many interactions that you can have in the real world. And I think I have some examples of this later on. Then, how many of you are familiar with sensory perception or sensory intelligence? No one? Okay, so sensory intelligence is something I've been reading up on lately. It's kind of a new field, and the idea is that we have all of this sensory information coming into our bodies, processed subconsciously, so we're not always aware of it. But it has effects like we get anxious, we can't concentrate, and we get tired. And all of this happens behind the scenes, and we don't necessarily know exactly why this happens. So sensory intelligence focuses on recognizing how the environment affects us on a sensory level and trying to compensate for that. And I think this is a very important point in an emotional model as well. The last point is that emotions is essentially just a closed loop system. Homeostasis, as Dave was saying earlier, we try to keep things the same. We try to stay alive, and that is the purpose of emotion. And it also allows us to learn from experience. If we have a negative experience, we try to avoid that experience next time. Thus, we're learning. And then I've also found that with this model, it allows us to have a dynamic personality. It's not something that I was initially planning for, but it seemed to just come out of the model automatically. This is kind of a terminology thing. I use two terms, sense and emotion, and I thought it's worthwhile just explaining the difference between the two. Dave was using the term percept, which is essentially my equivalent is sense. It's the same thing. It could either be something that happens internally, like you get hungry, or it could be that you've recognized something, like you've seen a lion. Sense is also, it's an unemotional trigger. There's no emotion directly involved with it. Like if you give someone a pinprick, that it's a signal that travels through his nerves to his brain. To that point, there's no emotion attached to it. And then I already said sense could be either physical or in the mind, where an emotion is triggered by sense. So you get a pinprick, it goes to your brain, and then you have an emotional experience, which happens usually in your amygdala or some part of the reptilian brain. It's a very primitive response. An emotion always suggests an action. So if you have an emotional experience, it tells you what to do. And then actions could either be by choice, or it could be a chemical process that happens in your body automatically. So if you get scared, your adrenaline will start racing, and you don't have any control over that. It just happens automatically. So this is a little overview, diagrammatic overview of how this is a closed loop system. First, you have your sensory input, which could be a pinprick. Then it's processed. And this is the first thing where you find the difference between different living organisms. If you have a fly, which only has a couple of neurons, not that much processing. If it's a human, we have got this cortex, which is patched on top of our reptilian brain, which allows us to do a huge amount of processing. So we can recognize things that basic animals will not be able to recognize. We can recognize circumstances, we can recognize social situations. Then we have an emotional decision, which I think is happening at a very basic level. This might be the same for all animals, all living creatures. And then we take an action, and this action also again is determined by how complex our brains are. But we find in reality it works a little bit more like this. You have an emotional decision, it gets passed on to the intellect, and then you make an intellectual decision what to do. And then when you do something, this feeds back into the real world. So there's the causality thing. If you do something, the world reacts to what you've done. And then that feeds back into your sensory input. So that closes the loop essentially. Emotional decision. So this is a practical example of how this might work. You get hungry, you want a cookie. You're 3 years old, you want a cookie. Your decision is you're going to take a cookie from the cookie jar. What happens? Your mother spots you and she slaps you on the wrist. This feeds back into your input. You feel hurt, you recognize mommy is mad at you, and you're not getting a cookie. Now you're very upset, you cry. And as a result, you're 3 years old, it's the first time you've done this, you get a hug and you get a cookie. Therefore you're getting a very positive result through this emotional closed loop system, keeping you alive and fed with cookies. So I said earlier that there's a limited number of emotions. So what I'm proposing is that, I kind of hinted at this earlier, I was saying that the fundamental interactions that we have with the real world is kind of the same, it's just more complex. So as an example, a long time ago you may have been a caveman, and you see a lion, you get attacked by a lion, and you recognize that as intentional physical harm to your body. A couple 100 years or 1,000 years later, you've got tribal wars, and they're throwing rocks at each other, and they recognize that's intentional physical harm. Today, people have guns, they might shoot at you, but it's all the same thing, and our body will interpret it in the same way. And then you have a couple of different things that might happen. If it's a lion attacking you, you recognize that you can't beat the lion, so you get scared, you run away. If it's the case that it's a rock fight and it's a little kid throwing a rock at you, you might get angry at him instead because you know that you will completely mess him up. But in both cases, you will probably get some sort of adrenaline rush because it's the fight or flight situation. It doesn't matter whether you're fighting or flighting, adrenaline is useful in both cases. So this is a little example of how every emotion has a particular purpose. It wants you to take a certain action. So for fear, you're trying to avoid. If you're angry, you're trying to destroy. And when you're feeling vulnerable, you might either beg or cry. So I thought you've got so many different emotions, I thought it's important to be able to classify them. So that you can say, are these two emotions really the same thing, or are they essentially different? And I thought the way of doing that is by classifying them by purpose. What is the purpose of this emotion? Is it the same as this emotion or different? I came up with 3 emotional attributes that you can use to classify them. The first and most important thing is this emotion that I'm experiencing telling me that this thing that's happening to me now, is it good or bad for my survival? And then it's also the question of, am I experiencing something that relates to a sense I'm having right now, or is it the expectation of a sense that I might experience later? So for instance, if I go to the doctor, I'm getting an injection, am I scared of the feeling pricked, or am I being pricked? And then there's the question of, when is this going to happen? Is it an immediate threat? And how important is this threat? And depending on those three attributes, it tells us how to respond in the future. So regarding good or bad, we want to acquire good, we want to avoid bad. Then we learn from experience, and we adjust our expectations. So this relates to the experience and expectation, and that closes the loop again. And then depending on how severe or how consequential or when this thing is going to happen, it determines our focus and our action. And by focus I mean, what is the most important thing to you right now? If you've got a large threat and a small threat, you're not going to worry about the small threat. So experience and expectation. So this relates to whether something is happening now or whether I'm worried about something happening later. Experience is what we're sensing now. Expectation is what we might sense later. And then expectation is memory of experience. So this is the one thing as well. Dave was saying we have the short-term memory and the long-term memory. And I think that's the biggest difference between our models. I have a concept of emotional memory, which is really primitive. You don't necessarily need to remember what happened. And a lot of the cases, we find that something might happen when you were 3 years old, have a traumatic experience, and now you're 20 or 30 years later, and you're still scared of something that caused you trauma when you were 3, but you don't remember why. You just have this emotional response. So emotional memory is not conscious. You don't necessarily remember why you have this emotional response. And actually, we are born with a lot of emotional response. Like when you're born, you get hungry. You don't need to be taught to get hungry. You just get hungry. As an example, if you touch a hot stove, you have a negative experience and you're not going to touch the hot stove next time. As an example, like I was saying with the needle prick, being eaten by a lion is the experience. The expectation is you might get eaten by a lion.
You cannot learn from it.
Depends. If you just bite your arm off,
Okay.
you might be a bit scared of lions next time. Imminence and consequence. Classification. Okay, so the one thing I thought was, you could think of it in terms of a grayscale, and this is how I actually implemented that first. But then I thought there is a qualitative difference between whether something affects your survival or whether it just affects whether it gives you an advantage or a disadvantage in your life or in society. Imminence. When should I expect the sense? Is it something that happens now or is it something that happens later? Right, so if a lion is about to attack you, that affects your survival. But if you're playing with a kitten and it scratches you, that just affects, you might just get infected, so it's not all that serious. The one, I haven't quite implemented all of this yet, but I have found that there's a difference in the way that you respond afterwards. So if something affects your survival, you tend to be really relieved and you feel like you want to give something back to society, where if it's something minor, you don't really care all that much and you forget about it really quickly. Emotional focus. So this is the other thing that I find is really important. As I was saying earlier, I had this initial idea that you have all of these emotions at the same time, but I couldn't quite figure out how to make them work together in determining an action. So at any given time, you may ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? And what are all the different things that I'm feeling right now, and how do I choose which one to respond to? You have all of these emotions competing for attention. And you actually get this thing coming back to sensory intelligence. You can suffer from something called emotional overload or sensory overload. Is when too many things are competing for your attention and you can't make a decision and you just feel overloaded and tired. And our mind works a little bit like an emotional switchboard. So you have all of these senses coming in. Some of them can be really loud. and suppress all of the ones that are not that loud. But in the end, it's a conscious choice. We have to decide which of these emotions we're going to respond to. As I just said, we can either just agree with one of these emotions coming in. So we could say, okay, I feel hungry. Yeah, let's just go with that. Or we can say, no, actually I've eaten too many sweet things today. I should not eat that. Which might be the smarter choice. Then there's the concept of agent. So when I'm experiencing an emotion, the question is, what am I experiencing? Why am I experiencing this emotion? Am I mad at that person or am I mad at that person? So you kind of keep a separate record for everything that you interact with. And I call that the agent, the thing that you're interacting with. Right. So who or what made me feel this way? In a way, it's the same as a sense. So you have all of these different senses. And you could say one sense is I'm having this emotional experience towards a human, but it's not the same for all humans. So I'm not sure exactly how to implement that yet. I'm halfway through it. But we need to keep a record of what we're interacting with. I think I'm almost done, Dave. As an example, a dog bit me. I'm not scared of all dogs, but I'm scared of that particular dog that bit me. Higher emotions, I'm not sure if that's the right term, but there are funny emotions like frustration and anxiety. Frustration is essentially just anger. It's a human emotion because normally if an animal gets angry, it just sorts out the problem and it either wins or loses and that's the end of it. But we get into these circumstances where we're trying to delicate electronics and we can't get it to solder properly and we get mad at it, but we know we can't strike it with a hammer, so we're suppressing it. So it's essentially a competition between what our emotions are telling us, be angry, and our intellect which says, don't be angry. So the question then is it an emotion or is it not an emotion? So you could say we're recognizing this particular situation, so I'm suppressing my anger, I'm recognizing that I'm frustrated, and you could say that is a sense. Anything I recognize could be a sense. Then you can take an action based on this realization, which means it's basically just like an emotion. But this can conflict with your basic emotions. As an example, you may want sweet things, but you know that it's bad for you, so you decide not to do it. And then you can have what I call the lower emotions, which is sometimes we find a logical excuse to simply do what we know we shouldn't be doing. Like if I eat a piece of cheesecake, that's okay because this morning I walked up the stairs. Which of course doesn't compensate for the amount of calories at all. Sorry, I went one slide too far. I'm going to skip over that one since my time's running. Yeah. Implementation. This one's quite important, so I'll just quickly run through that. So to bring it all together, how do you implement all of this? First, you need to determine what you are sensing. Are you being burned? Are you hungry? Have you just realized that your code compiles? You have to determine, is this an experience or an expectation of something that's going to happen? There's something I call quality, which is a kind of a couple of things put together. Like, am I experiencing pleasure? Is it good or is it bad? And so on. Intensity and imminence. This is an important thing as well. There's this concept of hedonic adaptation, which means we always find that we kind of feel the same. If something really good happens to us, we're happy for a short period of time, and then we go back to normal. And same thing if something bad happens, it just goes back to normal after a while. Focus, which I already explained, and what the agent is. So if we put all of that together, we kind of get a pretty good model that makes sense and can sort out most situations. And what I like to do is I look at real life examples. I pay a lot of attention to how people interact, how I feel about myself, how my daily my day goes, and I ask myself, will this model be able to simulate this situation and respond in an appropriate way? So I mentioned soul. I think this is just an idea. I think that if you were to say a robot has a soul, it needs to have the following ingredients. It needs to have basic emotions, like animals. It needs to have an awareness of its environment. It needs to also have an awareness of itself. And then it needs an awareness of society, of other people. And this is something that primates and humans have, and some mammals, but insects and things really don't. You could call it empathy. And I don't know whether anyone's read Susan Green's books. She talks about consciousness and ends the book saying that you can't say that humans either have consciousness or not consciousness. It's a continuum. So if you are an infant, you have a certain amount of consciousness, and as you grow up, you actually gain more consciousness because you gain awareness of what's going on around you. And that's the end. Do I have time for any questions?
We've actually just run a bit of coffee break, but so just a heads up, in 10 minutes we'll be starting getting here Enlighten Talks. But yeah, please, if you want to ask any questions, please do.
Right, anyone, any questions?
Did you just do a theoretical research or actually wrote something?
I have written some code. It's in LabVIEW. It's not completely finished yet, but it's getting there.
And the purpose is to put it in some kind of a model inside of now, or just generic thing?
Yeah, eventually I want to put it in now. The way it works at the moment is I have written a communication channel between now and LabVIEW, so I can actually get all the information from now that I need, simulate it, and then put it back on now to say how it should respond.